Thanks, Autumn. So just to be clear, I am actually going to talk about wind energy in addition to geothermal and solar, although I think I'll probably speak to different issues than Stephen. So my name is Suzanne Liou. I'm the Senior Policy Advocate at Renewable Northwest Project. And for those of you who are not familiar with RNP, we are a nonprofit, and we're a coalition of public interest organizations, primarily consumer and environmental groups, and renewable energy companies and affiliated organizations. So for example, wind developers, wind manufacturers, solar manufacturers, law firms that work with the industry, renewable energy marketers, those who sell RECs or renewable energy credits, the Columbia Gorge Community College that trains O&M staff to work on wind farms. Those are the kinds of organizations that are part of our membership. Our geography is Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho. And we essentially focus on three main areas of our work. The first is proper siting of projects. So we want to make sure that we have renewable energy projects in the ground, but that they are sited in a way that's environmentally responsible. The second thing is that we, and this is the bulk of our work, is we work to advance policies that promote renewable energy. So we want to make sure we expand the Northwest's untapped renewable energy resources. That's everything from renewable portfolio standards to incentives to working closely at the regulatory level with the PUC, the Public Utilities Commissions in these different states. So that's a big part of our work. And then finally, we work to expand the voluntary renewable energy market. So if you've been part of your, EWEB has a voluntary green power purchase program, for example, here locally. So do Portland General Electric and Pacific Power. And most utilities throughout the Northwest have green power purchasing programs. And we work to make sure that we expand those programs such that customers have the ability to go 100% renewable energy beyond what their utilities are required to provide. So I want to just first give you a sense of what the renewable energy resource potentials is in the Northwest. And many of you may not know that the Northwest is one of the best areas in the United States for renewable energy resources. We have just an incredible amount of renewable energy potential that is yet to be tapped. So for example, our wind potential is pretty incredible. And if you notice, you'll see it in actually a little bit later, where most of the developments have occurred in the Northwest. But in Oregon, most of the wind that's generated so far is in the Gorge area, which is just right on the border of Oregon, Washington, the northern border of Oregon, east of the Cascades. East of the Cascades. Although there's incredible potential in southeastern Oregon as well, and you may have heard about a couple of proposals in that part of the state. And if you notice, Montana has screaming wind. I mean, Montana has amazing wind. One of the reasons why we're not seeing development in that area is because of lack of transmission. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Just to give you some specifics, actually, how many of you are familiar with the term average megawatt? Okay, so wind and solar both are called variable resources. So, they're not necessarily generating energy all the time. So when you see the term megawatt, that usually refers to a plant's total capacity as if it were running 100% of the time. But because these facilities don't run 100% of the time because the resource is not available 100% of the time, average megawatts is really the term that shows what the amount of megawatt potential is based on the capacity factor, meaning that, for example, the capacity factor for wind typically is around 28 to 36% of the total potential. So average megawatts is really the amount of energy that you can get to see generated from these resources in the Northwest. So in Oregon, we've got almost 8,000 average megawatts. Washington is pretty similar. Idaho's a little bit less. Montana, 116,000 average megawatts. So again, we've got really incredible resource in Montana. The real levelized cost is around 4 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And the production tax credit that was fortunately just renewed only for a year for wind, although for solar and other resources, the renewal is about 8 years. But it's about 4 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour, and then the PTC, the production tax credit, which is based on the amount of energy generated from these facilities. It's a national tax credit. That's another 2 cents of a credit that will help reduce the price across the country. And then you can't, unfortunately, you can't read it, but the construction time is about 1 to 3 years. And it's true that the industry is getting much better at constructing very quickly. And one of the reasons why is, for example, what happened this year, where they were not sure if the production tax credit would be extended. So there's the construction teams and the industry and the people that they subcontract to have gotten very good at procuring turbines far in advance, often 2 to 3 years in advance, and understanding how to construct the facilities very quickly. Here's our solar potential. So how many of you have heard about, I'm sure all of you have heard about Germany's solar program, right? Sounds familiar? Okay, so the cloudiest part of Oregon has more solar radiation than the sunniest part of Germany. So while it seems like, we're kind of a cloudy place west of the Cascades, we actually have very good solar resource, and it gets even better, obviously, in southeastern Oregon and southwestern Idaho. In fact, the solar resource in those two areas of the Northwest is similar, not quite as good, but similar to the Southwest, where we're seeing large concentrated solar plants. One of the reasons why we're not seeing the development like we are of those plants like we're seeing in the Southwest, and I would say the primary reason, is because our energy rates are significantly lower, and because there's transmission to the Southwest that's bringing a lot of that power to places like California, where the rates are they're one of the, some of the highest rates in the country. But we have very good solar resource. We have about 30,000 average megawatts of potential. The capacity factor is a little bit lower, it's 16 to 30%. As I said, someone mentioned earlier, when you get to large solar power plants, concentrated solar power, that capacity factor can dramatically go up because of storage. So you can get, the technology is available now to get 6 to 8 hours of storage of that power after the sun goes down. It's pretty incredible. And again, just some estimates about the cost, 3 to 13 cents a kilowatt hour for direct thermal, which again is both thermal in terms of solar hot water heating. So again, that's less expensive than PV, which is electricity. But also, those prices are, they range, they range a lot for concentrated solar power, but they're in the range for that type of power as well. Keep in mind that these rates do not include the many incentives that we have available in the Northwest, especially in Oregon, or the federal investment tax credit that was, again, just renewed. The federal investment tax credit it's incredible. It's 30% of the total facility cost. And they just removed the residential cap. There was a $2,000 cap for residential customers who wanted to install solar. That cap is completely removed now. And it was removed prior for businesses. So that is a really sweet incentive. And then coupled with what we have in the Northwest, it's actually a really good time to do solar here in Oregon right now. And again, very short construction time. And then finally, geothermal. Again, we have great geothermal resource. And one thing that's really unique about geothermal is that it is base load, so you can rely on that power, more than 90% of the time. It has a real levelized cost that's a little more expensive than wind, and I think it's getting that. Could be a little higher than that. There is a long lead time in terms of drilling to test for geothermal. Okay, so 1998, we had essentially 2 utility-scale wind farms up and running in the Northwest. Not much going on despite all those resources. And here's what we have today. I'll show you a map in just a minute. We actually have over 2,300 megawatts of renewable energy in the Northwest right now, serving Northwest load. And that is a huge growth. Those 2 plants that I just showed you, I think total of about probably less than 300 megawatts. So we've seen incredible growth since then, and most of that growth has occurred just within the past couple of years. The vast majority of that growth is wind energy, but we are seeing increasing amounts of proposals for geothermal and solar energy in the Northwest. There's one project that's operating in Idaho called Raft River. There's several phases that have been proposed beyond that. There's 2 additional projects under construction in Oregon, Neal Hot Springs and Newberry Crater. And then solar is growing, and it's growing the most in Oregon, and that's in large part because of our incentive structure in place. It's also growing because the state has made it a priority to attract solar cell and module manufacturers to the state. How many of you are familiar with the BETC, the Business Energy Tax Credit? Okay, so about half of you are. I would say for commercial scale solar, that has been the single most driver for Oregon. And what the tax credit essentially provides for 50% of the cost of the facility, capped at the facility cost of $20 million. So essentially, you could get up to $10 million from the state if you're a business doing solar. It's a incredibly sweet incentive. In addition to that, if you're a customer of an investor-owned utility, PGE or Pacific Power, you can get rebates from the Energy Trust of Oregon. So you have the federal tax credit, the state tax credit, and rebates from the Energy Trust. Yes, also, if you're a residential customer, you can get a residential energy tax credit. It's 35%, and I believe it's capped at $5,000 or $6,000, but that's a very good incentive as well. And those are really the primary drivers for why we're seeing solar come online in Oregon. We were also heavily involved in the case before the PUC that was talked about earlier, that Bill Oley mentioned earlier, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. It was pretty interesting, but it was successfully resolved, and so I think we're going to see, again, continued growth in Oregon. Right now, the Energy Trust projects about 5 to 7 megawatts of renewables, solar specifically, coming online this year. So that just gives you a sense. So this is what it's like in 2008, and again, this is just kind of to wrap your head around where the projects are happening and the different project types. The vast majority of wind, as you can see, is right along that border, and that's because the vast majority of transmission is available there. Same thing with wind in southern Idaho. And we're seeing more solar projects, mostly in Oregon. So we've seen some large projects. One that you might hear about is, there's actually several right in the Eugene area. A lot of them have been developed by AES. And then there's a Sun Edison project that was done with Multnomah County. So Multnomah County is essentially putting solar on most of their major buildings. And it's another third-party power purchase agreement, which, again, I know has been discussed before. So it's pretty amazing what's happening in terms of solar in the state.
Hey, Suzanne, could you also you don't have the other slide that showed whatever it was 5-10 years ago, the two projects that are up?
Yeah, I can go back. These two?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's just, to me, it's remarkable. when you go from that and then go back to the next one. Sorry. There. I like that.
We do too.
10 years.
Yeah, 10 years, yeah. And most of this really, especially for large-scale wind, has just been in the past 2 or 3 years. In terms of proposals, let's see, what do I have next? Yeah. So in terms of proposals, most of the project proposals that we're seeing are still wind, but there are several proposals for geothermal. A lot in Oregon. A lot of them are expansions of projects that are either being constructed or have been constructed. There are several phases of Neal Hot Springs, for example. A lot of them are in the 10 to 15, 30 megawatt range. Most of the wind proposals we're seeing are in the 100 megawatt or more range. If you're familiar with the Shepherd's Flat wind farm, same area, the Columbia Plateau ecoregion area, that is around a 900 megawatt wind farm. It's one of the largest proposals in the country, and Southern California Edison actually signed a power purchase agreement with the developer of that project to buy all the power. So, we'll see what happens with transmission, but that's just an example of the kind of growth we're seeing. So these are some key issues that we as an organization think about when we think about expanding our renewable resource potential. The first is people. It seems kind of silly, but the coalition of groups that we work with would not be successful if they were not working as a coalition. The consumer groups that we work with, a good example in Oregon is the Citizens Utility Board. can speak from the cost and the risk benefits of renewables in comparison to other resources, especially coal right now, but natural gas prices are quite volatile, so they can speak to those benefits. The environmental community, obviously, but we also need the business community to be their own advocate. And that's a lot of what we do, is we work to make sure that the business community is involved and engaged just as much as the public interest community is. One of the most important things that we're going to need to do in the next year or so is defend the renewable portfolio standards that we have in place. We have 3 renewable portfolio standards in the Northwest, and essentially what that is a requirement that utilities provide a certain percentage of renewable electricity to their customers by a certain year. In Oregon, it's 25% by 2025. In Washington, it's 15% by 2020. And it's the same number in Montana, 15% by 2020. Excuse me, 15% by 2015 is what it is in Montana. I think Montana, we're hoping to improve a bit on the Montana RPS. One key piece of that will be transmission and will be allowing for larger projects. But for Washington, I can't express it enough how important the defense of the Washington RPS will be in the coming session. The politics are tricky in Washington, and the public utilities that are very heavily reliant on hydro and think of hydro as being, #1 capacity and think of hydro as being #1 renewable are wanting to expand the state's RPS to include more hydro. And while hydro is a renewable resource, the point of the RPS is to diversify our system mix. So it's going to be critical in terms of protecting the RPS in Washington. And then in terms of the RPS in Oregon, it's less about defense and more about implementation. So the Public Utilities Commission is is in the process of developing and finalizing rules that essentially are required in the RPS statute. And some of those pieces you may not know about, but are essential to get right. One example is the cost cap that's part of the renewable portfolio standard. So right now, the way the statute reads is that if the incremental cost for utilities to achieve the RPS is more than 4% of their revenue requirement, they don't have to meet it. And incremental cost is an interesting term because essentially what it means is it's the difference between the cost of paying for renewables and the cost of the alternative. And the alternative in reality is buying a natural gas, is paying for and constructing a natural gas plant. But it's also assuming that natural gas, the price of natural gas to serve that plant will be available over the course of 20 years or so. It's because you want to compare it to a renewable resource, right? The price of wind is free, #1, but it's also available for the price of the project's life, 20 years or so. So getting those numbers right and making sure that the utilities don't hit that 4% cost cap is all wrapped into the PUC implementation. So it's getting that right and being involved, and again, engaging the industry in that conversation is really important. As was mentioned earlier, wind integration is in the news a lot. I mean, if you're a dork and you read the business section, but I can't express how involved we are in this. Our research director is essentially spending all of his time working with the Bonneville Power Administration, other utilities, and our developers to be able to integrate wind into our system. And so a lot of that has to do with getting the scheduling right and getting the forecasting right. And it's amazing the difference in the cost of integration if you're not improving on scheduling. Doing 30-minute scheduling instead of 2-hour scheduling can actually reduce the cost of integration by 50 to 80%. So being involved in that and making sure that the utilities are planning for integration and doing the right analysis is critical. I'll mention 2 other things and then I'll wrap up. Siting, although it hasn't really been discussed at all, which kind of surprises me, is I would say #1 legal issue that developers and utilities deal with kind of on a daily basis when they're constructing a project. So, they need transmission, and they need a power purchase agreement, and they need, a strong renewable energy resource, but they also need to make sure that the project can actually get permitted. And working with environmental groups and agencies, and including mostly the fish and wildlife agencies at the state and federal level, to make sure there are both clear protections for wildlife and habitat, and to make sure that the industry has clear expectations for what kind of standards they should follow is another essential piece of it. We've been very involved in developing voluntary siting guidelines in Oregon and in Washington to help address those issues. And then finally, transmission. If you look at the proposals that exist in the Northwest, there are transmission proposals all over the place. Some of them go to major coal hub centers. In fact, the majority of them do, but they don't all have to. And a lot of those areas, I'll just go point you back here, that southeastern Oregon area, same area in Idaho, are where a lot of the lines are proposed to go. One unique solution that we have been working on is something called open season. And it's essentially where, if you're a wind developer, you can make an upfront financial commitment to a transmission developer if you want the line to go to that area where the resource is. And so we're working to develop unique solutions such that the transmission isn't going to the traditional sources of energy, but it's going to where the renewable sources are, and that it's actually getting financing to get built. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
I think Suzanne covered it. That's right. Since I don't think talk about wind, let's talk about carbon offsets.
Good afternoon. I'm Robin Hartmann with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. We're an organization that formed in 1971 to protect coastal and ocean resources, and we formed right on the heels of the beach bill being enacted in our state that put all of the coastline of Oregon into public trust. Our organization is known for our Coast Watch program, which is a mile adoption program. We have over 1,300 mile adopters, and they go out 4 times a year and make reports on human and natural changes that come to the beaches, and they post those on the website, which I provided there. I've had my mile. We all get pretty possessive of our miles, but I have had my mile since for 10 years. It's mile number 151.
Where's that on the coast?
Glad you asked. That's my mile there. It's, if you look down here, here's the Umpqua River. This is the spit, the sand spit that, if you're looking south this way. And the sand spit, this Oregon Dunes Recreation Area goes out, right here is about the end of the sand spit, and the Umpqua River, flows into the ocean right up here by 148, just about.
Do you get along with your neighbors, too?
I have great neighbors on my neighboring miles.
So she calls them 148.
Yay, all right, another Coast Watcher. What is interesting about my mile, I'll just let you know, is I've been involved with this wave energy issue for a while now, and it was partway into this whole discussion about wave energy that I realized that the first project that will probably go forward in Oregon is going to be located right off my mile. So it'll be located 2.5 miles out in the territorial sea right off my mile. So it all of a sudden became sort of personal. I serve on Oregon's Ocean Policy Advisory Council, and my role is I fill the Coastal Environmental Group position on that council. There are 14 voting members on the council and a lot of good agency experts, agencies that have authority within Oregon's territorial sea. We advise the governor and the state agencies and local governments. Our priorities are getting a system of marine reserves or fully protected areas in the ocean established. I'm sure you've heard about that. It's really hot in the news these days. And also wave energy, making sure that development that occurs in the ocean takes into account current ocean users like fishermen, as well as important ecological areas. So this symposium is about renewable energy, and I was asked to talk about the current and upcoming renewable sources of energy available in the Northwest, and I'm focusing on wave energy. And the questions are they practical? What are their costs? And what are the legal issues? So I just gave that some thought. From a practical perspective, the wave energy industry, their research branch is the Electric Power Research Institute. They looked across the nation in 2004 and 2005 to look at potential offshore sites for wave energy. And they looked closely at Oregon because we have good conditions, wave conditions off our coast. So what they used to determine whether it was practical here was, what is the wave energy resource like? What are the characteristics of the nearshore environment? Out to our 3 mile, how deep, does anybody want to take a guess at how deep our ocean is out at 3 miles? Shout it out.
2 miles.
About the deepest spot in our ocean, 3 miles off, is about 200 feet. It's in the 200 to 250 feet. I was surprised myself too, because I thought our ocean, but really shortly beyond that, it drops off, the shelf drops off. But out 3 miles out, it's only like 200 to 250 feet deep. So they found a lot of things here in Oregon that were important for location of wave energy sites, including good ports where you could get a labor pool of people to service the facilities that would be established. So they identified potential sites, and the sites that are sort of going forward now are the Reedsport project right off my mile, the Coos Bay project by the same company, Ocean Power Technology, and then Tillamook. Actually, there's 4. Tillamook County has proposed 3 or 4 different wave energy sites, and they're taking the lead in trying to work with companies to come and use those sites. And then Douglas County has also proposed a wave energy facility off the jetty, off Winchester Bay. These are just a quick overview of the types of technologies. There's about 80 companies. They have amazing different types of technologies. The point absorber is, or the wave buoy is what is being proposed for Oregon mostly. For instance, the OPT project off of my mile will have about 10 of these buoys to start with, and eventually we'll have about 100 buoys. They're about 37 feet above water, 100 some feet below water. They are out at 2.5 miles, and they're about 30 some feet in diameter. Then there's this big oscillating water column, a wave attenuator, and this overtopping device is the type of device that Douglas County would be proposing to build on the jetty. It looks a little bit different. It's made out of concrete. So then how is Oregon looking at the practical side of it? And I just wanted to give you a few references. There's on the OSU campus, there's a wave energy center called the Wallace Energy Systems Center. And they have a wave, indoor wave test site you can make waves and try things out. They're working with the technology and trying to advance the technologies. The Oregon Innovation Council has proposed, it's a group of kind of movers and shakers and business people in Oregon. They kind of advised the legislature and advised in 2007 for Oregon to invest $4.2 million in studying whether wave energy, good wave energy could be developed here in Oregon. And also the Wave Energy Trust was formed out of some of that funding, and it's to promote responsible wave energy development in the state. So then what are the costs? Well, the Oregon Wave Energy Trust, and I serve on their board kind of as the environmental person on the board. The cost, OWET's trying to look at some of the costs that the industry faces, which is research and development. For instance, the technology is advancing so quickly that what would have taken 14 buoys to produce the same amount of energy at the OPT Reedsport site will now take 10 buoys because they're able to make more energy with each buoy. OWET's also helping with public outreach efforts and looking at the regulatory coordination and environmental issues. These are some of the main issues and the costs that the industry is facing. But I have to think about this from an ecological cost and sort of weigh the need for renewables and the urgency for getting renewables in place with the unknown factors in the ocean and the ecological importance of our nearshore ocean. So the costs are ecological costs that we're focused on. On OPAC, I serve as chair of the Wave Energy Working Group, and we've focused on two areas. One is we've pushed forward an ecological effects workshop that was funded by OWET, and we're looking at a cumulative effects study that would kind of look into the future and think, what if you had 8 to 10 of these facilities up and down our coast, 2.5 miles off, with 100 buoys each, and what if, what would that do 20, 25 years out, to sort of think ahead. So this ecological effects workshop was held in Newport last fall. There were about 50 scientists. The goal was to talk about what do we know and what are the gaps, how would you study ecological impacts, how do you monitor, what do you need to know for baseline information before you put these devices in the water. Bottom line, just recently, like within the last few weeks, the paper that was produced out of that is available. So if you wanted to go to this website down here, oregonstate.edu, Wave Energy, it's a 200-page document with this proceedings from that workshop. But I'm going to hit a couple topics here. For instance, there's concern from the scientists about the potential for whale entanglement. There's a lot of mooring lines and electric lines that run from buoy to buoy, especially with lines that are loose, not taut, and most of these are taut. There's potential for, especially in storms or big ocean conditions, that whales could get entangled. Gray whales can't back up. They are baleen feeders. They feed with their mouth open, and if they get caught on like a crab pot line or a fishing line, they carry that with them. So scientists are looking at how could we address that issue. Didn't really mean to make this happen like that. New hard structures in the ocean. This is kind of, some people have characterized these as being like metal jungles or metal forests that are in the ocean that create brand new habitat in places that hasn't been there before. So you would get probably get top of the food chain predatory fish attracting prey, salmon, with salmon smolts maybe going through there. So there's concerns about predation on salmon smolts coming out of the rivers where these places, where these wave energy sites may be located near rivers. So, and then there are the cost to other ocean users. If you go on the coast or if you open a newspaper on the coast, you hear about this a lot. The same type of bottom habitat that wave energy sites would be using, which is sandy bottom, so their big anchors can set in, are crabbing spots for the coastal communities, and it's a big industry on the coast. Also, it will be soon an effort to map where do the fishermen actually fish in the ocean, because this is thought of as proprietary information about an area that is a common area, but they like to keep that information close. So then I wanted to address the legal issues a little bit. That's my mom, by the way. That's on my mile. Oregon Shores has been involved just thinking about the legal side and the policy side, because we like to teach our members about how they can be effectively involved in advocating for protection of the ocean. The most interesting, where you start with wave energy is that the state really doesn't have the primary authority here, although there is some state authority. It's all up to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the same folks who oversee liquefied natural gas. And so they have the siting authority, but we have a couple protections under the Federal Power Act. Section 4E means that it's equal consideration rule, which means fishing, recreation, environment, and energy development all have equal consideration. And Section 10A1 says that FERC has to look at comprehensive plans if they're in place. So the state's been working to update its territorial sea plan because of that. That's kind of a messy slide, but other legal issues have to do with because FERC has jurisdiction over this issue because it's considered hydropower, but FERC is not prepared to do wave energy because they do traditional hydropower, so it's a brand new thing for them. If you go past the 3 Mile, Mineral Management Service has authority, MMS, and their expertise is oil and gas exploration and offshore drilling, that sort of thing. And so between the two of them, there's a big effort to try to get that sorted out about who has jurisdiction from the 3 Mile out to 12 Mile. So that needs to be sorted out. Leasing of the seafloor. This means that companies will get a lease from the state, and the state worked hard this last year through rulemaking about what it would require from companies to lease a piece of the seafloor. And then over the long run, under the Federal Power Act, such as with dams and other facilities, allows for a lease to become ownership. And so there's a concern that what happens down the line where you've got a small company, a good company like OPT, earnestly working on this site, and then 15 years down the line, another company buys them out, and then there's ownership of Oregon seafloor, and you don't know what's going to happen. So people are concerned about that. Other legal issues, because wave energy is brand new, companies and because it's buoys in many cases, there's an interest in incrementally expanding that, starting with 10 buoys to study, maybe expanding to 20, maybe expanding then to commercial build out of 100. But with a traditional hydro, which FERC oversees, you don't have a real clear process from going to a little tiny dam to a bigger dam to a bigger dam. That just isn't the way it's set up. So there's issues related to that. Then in Oregon, Oregon Water Resources Department has some barriers for wave energy, and it was because years ago there was an effort to kind of make sure there were not additional dams built on anadromous fish or salmon rivers with salmon on them. And so there was put in place a no dead fish rule. And because that applies to hydro, there's a concern that maybe that would be a deal killer for any kind of building of wave energy projects in the ocean, because there's 100 ways that a fish could get killed, which is attracting seals or sea lions in this new structure in the ocean, and they would become, predators for salmon. So we're busy amending the territorial sea plan. That process is going on over the next couple of years under an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with FERC. Governor Kulongoski signed a MOU that said, hey, FERC, can you hold off? We're amending our territorial sea plan. We don't want anything but studies here until we get that done. Also, from an environmentalist perspective, we really believe this marine reserve effort needs to go forward first so we can identify our sensitive ecological areas in our ocean and get some protection for those. The governor also issued Executive Order 0708 defining a process and a timeline for getting marine reserves done, and that's currently underway. So in closing, you probably heard it earlier from Secretary Bradbury, and David's probably going to talk a little bit about it, but we're moving from climate change and having people, change that into climate action. And we can do things on a personal level, like just changing 3 light bulbs in your house to compact fluorescence, just improving your gas mileage by 5 miles a gallon. Those things are like taking thousands of cars off the road. Policy changes, I'm sure Secretary Bradbury talked about how we can make a difference, just our 3 states sticking together and because we're responsible for 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions in just the 3 states alone. So policy changes we make here make a difference overall for the nation. And then if you really have a stomach for it, you could come to the Ocean Policy Advisory Council meetings. There's 2 coming up, but they can get kind of raucous. So those are in Florence on the 23rd and 24th of this month, and then in Lincoln City on the 17th and 18th of November, and they'll be focused on marine reserves and amending the territorial sea plan. And so I just wanted to close it. It's a tough balancing act, and you'll think, what in the heavens is this about? You know, all of us want to save, this is just an example, you want to save homeless animals, take them in, but at the same time, how many wild birds get eaten by having, you know, your cat? So you got to look at this, the balance of saving something and then protecting something. Mostly I wanted to put this in there because of that big picture of that big cat. I have one exactly like that, but he's not that big.
Is it a lion?
Is it a lion? No, that was a real cat. That's a Maine Coon cat. So again, this is my mile, and there are a lot of challenges for bringing wave energy to Oregon. And the next slide I will show you is one of the challenges. This is my mile. The winter after that mile, that picture was taken. These are the same picture. Oops. Anyway, these were the same place. And so the industry's, the wave energy industry has a challenge just in the ocean is a big ocean. It's got a lot of potential out there. One season, it was just pure sand. The next season and the following seasons, it was just nothing but big logs from the having come in from the Umpqua, most likely. So thank you, and if you have any questions, let me know. I can be reached at robin@oregonshores.org.
So is everybody still with us? We're at the halfway point here. My name is Stephen Hall. I'm a partner at the law firm of Stoel Rives. I'm in the Portland office, and I'm also the chair of the firm's Renewable Energy Initiative. And my topic is wind energy, and Suzanne has fortunately covered a lot of the easy stuff for me. What I planned to talk about was wind energy in general, talk about some of the policy things that are driving the growth of wind energy, and then, considering the audience that's here, talk about something that I hope would be of interest, which is the role that lawyers play in developing renewable energy projects. So Suzanne covered a lot of these things, and some of these are self-evident about renewable energy, but one point is that wind energy projects give substantial economic benefits to rural communities. One part of that is through property tax payments to local rural governments, and then the other part is lease payments to ranchers and farmers who wouldn't otherwise be able to use their property. Another thing is green-collar jobs. If anybody's read Thomas Friedman's book, I mean, this is part of, you know, it's not just creating renewable energy, but renewing national power. And green-collar jobs, manufacturing and construction. And finally, when you put a megawatt of renewable energy on the grid, you're displacing a megawatt or almost a megawatt of thermal energy from a coal-fired power plant or from a natural gas-fired power plant. And so by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're helping to fight climate change. This sheet right here shows the growth of installed wind in the United States since 1985. And the growth's been amazing. It's gone from 1,000 megawatts in 1985 to over 20,000 megawatts in 2008. One thing about energy, the industry in general, is that there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of agencies, and for some, and a lot of technical terms. And so for somebody who's, you know, just aware of this on the periphery, it can be a little bit challenging. Once you understand the acronyms like Chad Marriott does, it's much easier at that point, and that's half the battle. Let me put this in perspective. 1 megawatt of energy from a wind project is enough to power about 250 or 300 US homes. So 1,000 megawatts up there, you're talking about 250, 300,000 homes. When you talk about 20,000 megawatts, you're talking over 5 million US homes powered by clean renewable energy, or an equivalent would be 1 million plug-in hybrid cars, which is the equivalent of 100 million gallons or 100 million barrels of oil per year. So that's a significant number. Germany has a little bit more wind energy installed, but we produce more electricity because we have a better wind resource here. It's windier here in the United States. This is a map that shows how much wind generation has been installed around the United States. You'll notice that Texas is the leader, big surprise there. California, Oregon and Washington, we have a good resource. The best resources, in fact, are in the plain states, but no people live there. So they can't use the energy that would be produced there, but once we solve some of the transmission problems, there'll be an ability to bring that energy to market. The reason that Texas and California especially are leaders in renewable energy and have the most wind energy is that they have aggressive state policies, which in combination with federal policies make it more attractive to site wind projects there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Here are just some statistics I thought people would find interesting about your typical wind turbine. It's on a 240-foot tall tower. Each of the blades is 120 feet long. The rotor is the 3 blades, so the diameter across there is 240 feet. Each one produces 1.8 megawatt hours of energy on average. Wind is an intermittent resource. The wind doesn't always blow. In the Pacific Northwest, it actually blows more at night than during the daytime. Each one of those is enough to power 500-600 U.S. homes. The cost of that's about $1.5 million per turbine. So you're driving along the Columbia River Gorge, you see a turbine, you're like $1.5 million, $1.5 million, $1.5 million. Life of a typical project is 25 years. The reason, the number one driver for the growth of wind in the United States has been what's called the production tax credit. And if you've been following anything about the federal bailout or the rescue plan, depending on how you want to describe it, one of the things that got tacked on at the 11th hour was a 1-year extension of the production tax credit. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but every energy source is subsidized, and wind energy is no exception. Oil and gas get depletion allowances, there's tax deductions for different energy resources. The biggest subsidy, in fact, is the invisible subsidy of being able to put greenhouse gases up in the air at no cost to the generators of fossil fuel generation, but then society pays for that in health costs and climate change. But for renewable energy, there's a production tax credit, and so for each kilowatt hour of renewable energy that's generated from a wind farm, there's a tax credit that can be used to offset income. Oregon has tax credits, and Suzanne talked about that, and I won't repeat that. Renewable portfolio standards. This is another policy thing that's driving renewable energy development across the country. And a renewable portfolio standard, or an RPS, is, back up one step, there's no federal law requiring renewable energy. But there are 28 states that have adopted renewable portfolio standards, which require utilities in their states, some of the utilities at least, to have a certain percentage of renewable electricity in their portfolio of energy. And so rather than give an economic incentive up on top, that just kind of moves the demand curve over. If you can think of supply and demand, it requires utilities to meet that standard. And then another policy incentive is carbon policy. And these are, laws that are in place or being discussed or being proposed that would somehow try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so this could be a carbon tax. This could be cap and trade. On the east coast of the United States, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has put in a cap and trade program for power plants there. And on the west coast, we have the Western Climate Initiative, which has a draft plan that certain state legislatures are looking at. California has passed cap and trade legislation. And so in all of those areas of the country, if utilities buy wind power, that's a hedge against these costs. They won't have to pay the carbon tax for renewable energy. They'll be outside of cap and trade. So some of the challenges for wind. Suzanne touched on transmission a little bit, but to kind of go down one level, the issue with transmission is that if you take a natural gas-fired power plant and you have a city, and the city needs more power, you can put that power plant right next to the city and generate electricity right there. But if you're going to use wind as your resource, you have to build the power plant where the wind is. And when, you know, as this country developed from the Pilgrims onward, generally cities were not built in the windiest places. They were built where the weather was nice, it was close to a river. And so the best wind resources are generally in the places where nobody lives. So you have the problem of having to take that electricity, generate it, you know, in eastern Oregon, and then bring it over the Cascades onto the west side. And so that's the transmission issue. Wildlife issues, the first generation of wind projects looked like those old-time windmills with a little blade on there, and they were really harmful to birds. The next generation ones with the larger blades and the bigger rotor have solved a lot of those issues, and there's a lot of other interesting things, but you'd mentioned cats. Actually, for every 10,000 birds, I saw this, just read this when I was doing some research for this. For every 10,000 wild birds that are killed, half of them are killed by household cats, and one of them is killed by a wind turbine. So, good trivia to know. Aesthetics. This is kind of a cutting edge. You know, you're familiar with NIMBY. You know, the NIMBY issues of. You know, the local utility wants to build a transmission line through your backyard, and you're like, whoa, hold on a minute. Well, believe it or not, there are some people who are objecting to having wind farms being built out in rural areas, and their objection is aesthetics, that they're saying, I have an unobstructed view of the mountain, and now with these wind turbines across there, you know, you're affecting, and this is the term, is view shed. You know, that I have a right to this, and those of you in property law know that you don't have a right to the view and you don't have a right to those things. But those are some of the objections, and that's kind of the cutting edge legal issue there of what rights do people have to an unobstructed view. And then wind integration, to drill down on this a little bit more, the problem, the challenge of integrating an intermittent resource like wind or solar into the grid is that, you know, looking again at our natural gas fired power plant, that plant runs on a steady, predictable basis, whereas wind goes up and it goes down. And from the perspective of a utility that's managing the transmission grid, and for every second of every hour has to keep enough energy generation to match all of the loads. So if I click on my air conditioner, somewhere a power plant comes on, or if I turn off a light, somewhere a power plant has to be backed down. When you have intermittent resources, it's kind of like somebody's there with a big switch, turning it on, and the wind stops blowing for a little bit, they turn it off. And so at the utility, they have to manage that, and they have to have other generation there. And some of those resources are like natural gas-fired power plants, and they have to have those there ready so that if the wind falls down, they can bring it back up. Or if the wind really starts blowing, they can back down other generation. So managing that, figuring out who pays for it and how it works, that's what wind integration is about. All right. So real quickly, on a typical renewable energy project, and this would be true of wind, solar, an ocean project, a geothermal project, a biomass project, most of these are built by independent developers. So it's not a utility building, it's not Portland General Electric, you know, or Pacific Power, but it's an independent company that comes in and builds the project and then sells the electricity to a utility. So you're going to have a developer. You're going to have a landowner. Somebody's going to own that property where the project's built. It might be the federal government, might be an Indian tribe, might be a rancher. You're going to have a utility that's going to buy the output of the project. You're going to have contractors who have the equipment and bring it in and construct the whole thing. You're going to have equipment manufacturers that manufacture wind turbines and towers. And then you're going to have the people who put up the capital to build this, lenders, investors. And each one of those parties has a lawyer, and there's contracts between all of them, and that's where lawyers come in. And so here's a list, and it took me about 30 seconds to just make that list of some of the things I could think of, that here's where lawyers interact with a renewable energy project. So the first thing is site control. Let's take as a hypothetical that over in Eastern Oregon, collectively this whole room has put together a development company, and we're going to build a wind farm, okay? So first of all, we have to find a place where it's windy. So we go out there, and we're all out there in our pickup trucks with our, trucker caps on. We find a spot where it's windy. Okay, so we go out and talk to the ranchers who own the property. Somebody's going to have to negotiate a lease with them with rights to do more wind testing there and development. The title may not be good, so you've got to kind of clear any clouds on the title. Sometimes we've worked at Stoel Rives on projects where there might be 70 or 80 different parcels with different owners, and grandma conveyed it to the nephew, and then somebody died, and there's a break in the chain of title. That all has to be cleared before an investor is going to put money into this. So that's site control. An interconnection agreement is the contract between our company and the utility that has the transmission lines so that we can plug into the grid. That's just to plug in. That doesn't guarantee that we can, the word is wheel our electricity to California or to Portland General Electric or anything. And to hook up our wind farm, we might need to build a great big substation there to plug into it so that it can take the low voltage from the wind farm and step it up so that it can go on a transmission line. So there's negotiation on those agreements. The FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has pro forma agreements, but you negotiate off of that. Permitting and siting. We heard about some of the siting challenges for an ocean project with all the marine mammals. Those are lawyers and environmental consultants working on that. In most states, you have to have approval from the state to site a brand new power plant or an energy facility. One state, big surprise where you don't need that, Texas. That's why Texas has so many wind farms, because you don't need any permits. You just start turning dirt and putting steel in the ground. Regulatory approvals. You're going to have state regulatory approvals. You're going to have federal regulatory approvals. If you want to sell electricity, that's governed by the federal government, and so you need a power marketing license. You also need to have certain other certifications. Lawyers figure that stuff out for clients. Do I need this? Well, I need that, and make the applications. The power purchase agreement is the most important contract, and maybe I say that because I work on a lot of them. But this is kind of what the whole project revolves around, because this is the financing document. And what a power purchase agreement is, this is from our wind farm. We've set up our special purpose entity, LLC, to build this wind farm. And so we go out and we negotiate with EWEB to buy all of the output from our project. And if the contract is an enforceable contract, then we can start talking to bankers and investors and say, we have a 25-year commitment from a utility that's solid to buy the output from our wind farm. And we need this much capital to get it built and money to come in after it's constructed. And so a power purchase agreement for a wind farm typically runs to 100 pages, lots of schedules. Everything is heavily negotiated. This is not like when you sell a car and you kind of get a form off the internet and everybody signs it and you're good. It's heavily negotiated, and on the utility side, they will have attorneys in-house or maybe outside counsel who are very knowledgeable, and so you're negotiating all the way down line by line for that. It takes months to negotiate them. It's a lot of fun, too. Equipment procurement agreements. Each one of those wind turbines, I was saying, $1.5 million. Each one of those, the biggest part of the cost is that wind turbine, and so you've got to negotiate that. Warranties are a big issue with that. If we build our wind farm and all of a sudden the turbines stop working, we're going to lose a lot of money. And so then they'd say, well, what did you negotiate in the warranty? And so, that's another example of where lawyers come into it. Construction and O&M agreements. We're going to have to hire a construction company to come in and put up this whole wind farm, and so those are big, long, thick contracts that are negotiated. O&M is that once it's up and running, more guys and gals in pickup trucks with trucker hats will come out there and and make sure everything's running all right. Because of all the tax incentives, all of these structures, there's a lot of tax law questions, and if you won't get the right tax treatment for your project, then you won't get investors, or you'll have other problems. So there's tax lawyers are involved in this. Corporate structuring, like I said, these are set up as special purpose entities, a standalone company. And then project finance and debt. For the investors or the banks that lend money, they have lawyers. Our development company would have lawyers, and you'll negotiate all the documents for how they would invest or lend money. So that was a short list. There's other things too. And if you're interested in learning kind of any more about legal issues with any kind of renewable technology, go to our website. And we have these books that we've written. And there's one for solar, one for wind, ocean, biofuels, geothermal, green building, and each one is broken out in chapters for the different legal issues that come up if you're trying to, build an ocean project or a biodiesel plant or something like that. And I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end once we finish, and if we run out of time, I'd be happy